Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This is PA Books, featuring authors of books about Pennsylvania's people, politics, history, and business. This week, Leonard Warren discusses his biography of the 19th century Philadelphia scientist, Joseph Leidy.
Leonard Warren, author of Joseph Leidy, The Last Man Who Knew Everything, you say in your book that Joseph Leidy's brain is in a jar at the University of Pennsylvania.
At the Wistar Institute.
Why is it there?
The reason is that at the turn of the century, there was the feeling among scientists that might be possible to tell what sort of a person contained a brain, the brain, just from and his characteristics by an examination of his brain after his death, the number of folds and that sort of thing. Shape, configuration, the size was very important. A society was formed, and to join the society, you had to will your brain to the society, and they would do all the measurements and so on. Joseph Leidy was the president of that society. As a result, brains accumulated not only from great achievers, rather famous men, scientists and so on, but also criminals, degenerates. They wanted to make a clear distinction between the brains of the achievers and the brains of criminals and murderers. Of course, they found no differences. The largest brain of all was from a carpenter, of no particular intellectual achievement. And gradually, this sort of idea died out, but they still had the brains. So they have been stored in the basement of the Wistar Institute for almost 100 years now.
Any plans to do anything with them?
No, nothing particular. Sometimes they're called upon for displays of one sort or another. But no, it's scientifically there's really very little merit to having them. They're just there and they fail to dispose of them. I mean, it would be almost vandalism to get rid of them. On the other hand, there have been some that have been disposed of inadvertently. For instance, a very sloppy attendant dropped the brain of Walt Whitman, and it was destroyed, so that they no longer have Walt Whitman's brain. They had to sort of scoop it off the floor.
What happened to Joseph Leidy's body?
Well, he was incinerated. I mean, cremated. He felt that the conventional burial in a coffin was really the same process. It was an oxidation process. He'd rather go oxidize rapidly. And he wouldn't occupy much of the surface of the earth. He felt that it was a rather primitive, wasteful procedure to bury people in coffins and occupy land.
Now, your book is called The Last Man Who Knew Everything. What do you mean by that?
Well, let me just say that it is a bit of hyperbole. I mean, nobody knows everything. He wasn't all that well versed in music, in the arts, in the humanities, although he knew something of it. He was, in the field of science, he was a master of biology, botany, and zoology. He was a master of geology. He knew a tremendous amount of anatomy. He knew a lot about medicine. He was an expert with insects and plants. He knew the plants around the Philadelphia area to a greater degree than any other botanist. He had an enormous capacity to assimilate and absorb and assimilate knowledge. And he was so expert in so many fields that I say he knew everything, because he got this reputation when he was living, and he used to receive anytime anybody found anything that they didn't know what it was, or a fossil bone, or a dead animal that no one had ever seen, or a plant, they'd send it to Leidy, because if Leidy didn't know, nobody knew. He was sort of an authority. Many things that were shipped to the Smithsonian for identification were immediately transferred to Leidy by Spencer Baird, who was a lifelong friend of Leidy's, who was the head of the Smithsonian Institute, and as a matter of fact taught at nearby Dickinson College here for many years.
How did it come about that you wrote a book about him?
Well, when I first came to Philadelphia, I knew nothing of Leidy. I'd never heard of the man. I had come from Washington, from the National Institutes of Health, where I was working. And to get to my laboratory, I had to go through a building, which was the biology building of the University of Pennsylvania, and it was called the Leidy Building. Didn't mean anything to me. And it was a large building, and just there was a frieze around, just under the cornice, in which the names of the greats were carved out. Darwin, Aristotle, Lamarck, all the great names, and there was Leidy. I thought, who is Leidy? To be in this class. And then a friend of mine became the Joseph Leidy Professor of Anatomy at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. And then when I went home, I passed Leidy Boulevard, and there was a Joseph Leidy School. So I started looking into it, and the more I investigated, the more attracted I became. I mean, familiarity bred admiration. He got better and better as I learned more and more about him. And that book is a distillation of a lot that I learned about the man and his times.
How'd you write it?
What
kind of research did you do?
Well, you see, the wonderful thing about doing this sort of work is, historical work, especially 19th and 18th century in Philadelphia, is that you have all these marvelous treasure houses. First of all, you have the University of Pennsylvania Library, the Van Pelt, which has just got everything. And then there's the library and the archives of the American Philosophic Society and the Academy of Natural Sciences, and also the library company, that's Benjamin Franklin's library, and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. They are just so rich, you don't really have to travel too much. I have been here and there to Boston once, to the Smithsonian once or twice, but it's pretty well all in Philadelphia. And it was very convenient. And being a senior citizen, I could hop onto a bus or a streetcar and get there all day for nothing. So there I was.
When did he live?
He was born in 1823, and he died in 1891. And he was born, he was a pure Philadelphia product. He was born, raised, educated, worked, and died in Philadelphia, all within a radius of about 3 miles. He was born on 3rd Street, just north of Market. And then he bought a house on Filbert Street in the shadow of the City Hall. And the last year of his life, he moved to Spruce Street. And
what did he do for a living?
His central job that provided him with the wherewithal to live was he was professor of anatomy at the University of Pennsylvania. His primary job was to teach medical students anatomy. But on top of that, he was the chief curator of the Museum of the Academy of Natural Sciences. Those were his two main jobs. He's an MD. He was an MD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1844.
He finished medical school when he was 21 years old?
Yes.
Is that unusual? At the time?
No, because schools, first of all, the medical school was just a couple of years, you know, and 3 months per year, so there was nothing. And it wasn't, the demands weren't, then weren't what they are today. So he was young, very young, and he went into practice. His father was a sort of no-nonsense kind of person. And he insisted that his son may start making a living, open a practice, get married, have children like normal people do. And he was interested in nature, in doing research, his research. And he opened a practice at the insistence of his father, but his heart wasn't in it. And the story is that when his first prospective patient came to the front door, he locked it, backed off, and waited till the person went away. This went on for 2 years until he finally quit. And his father was dismayed.
You also said that for a time he was assistant coroner of the city of Philadelphia?
Yes, he had a he was a workaholic. It's quite apparent. On top of all his jobs, he was an assistant coroner to the coroner of the city of Philadelphia, and he took it upon himself to examine in great detail any animal that died on city streets or that died in circuses, menageries of various kinds, people's pets, and so on. As a result, over a 5 or 10 year period, he examined in great detail hundreds of species of animals, all sorts of animals, and he became America's leading comparative anatomist because of his vast experience in comparing different animal forms. And this, of course, came in very handy when he went into paleontology, the examination of fossil bones of extinct animals, which he put together to sort of recreate the animal which gave rise to the fossil bones.
When he would examine them, what would he do? I mean, would he take notes or write papers about it?
Yes, he would describe them very well. He was, I should say, that he was a wonderful artist and a marvelous illustrator. And some of his stuff, it just takes your breath away. It's just so beautiful.
We have some of these pictures here that he drew.
Unfortunately, those aren't in color.
He did them in color originally?
He did them in color, and they are just beautiful.
What are these?
I beg your pardon?
What are these that we're looking at?
Oh, these are unicellular organisms. They are amoeba. He gave the name amoeba proteus to amoeba, among other. But he was the father of American parasitology and of protozoology. These are protozoans. They are unicellular beasts that either plant or animal. The plant having having chlorophyll, or the animals that don't. Getting back to the drawing, you know, he showed a precocious talent as an artist, and his father immediately wanted him to be a sign painter, painting signs of horses over tavern doors. His mother, stepmother actually, was a strong, intelligent woman who had higher ambitions. She made sure he went to the medical school to exercise his talents. She thought in medicine he could do a lot better. And of course, the medical school was only a few blocks away. And He graduated, as I said, in 1844. At that time, he was very fortunate because the University of Pennsylvania was, without question, the best medical school in the country, and he went to it.
What is parasitology?
Well, let me go back to the animals on city streets. As I said, he examined literally hundreds of species of animals, the weirdest material. The thing he noticed was that every creature has other creatures living on them or in them, whether they bugs of insects of various kinds, fungi, worms, all sorts of things. And these could be inside in the organs or outside. And what he noticed was that in some cases, it was of no consequence. They were just there. They did no harm. They did no good. In some cases, for instance, he examined termites and beetles and millipedes, but he examined the termite especially, what was in the intestines of the termite. And he found that it was cramped with these organisms that you just saw, these protozoa. And he was able to figure out that the two had to live together, the termite and the organisms in his gut. That's how a termite lives and digests wood. That the termite bites and chews up the wood, goes into the stomach, the little organisms in the gut digest, and they both live happily.
So the termite couldn't digest the wood without these?
A termite without these organisms could not digest wood.
He worked with a microscope?
Yes.
You talked to him about him as a microscopist?
Microscopist. There were microscopists before Leidy. There's no question about that. In fact, there was a man called Bailey at West Point who was a very fine microscopist. But when Leidy came on the scene, he transformed the microscope to a sort of an exotic instrument that, was very special to just a powerful, everyday working analytic instrument. He applied it to plants, to animals. He applied it to rocks and minerals, to gems. He showed how why certain gems are opalescent through the striations which he observed and measured under the microscope. In every field, he just simply applied it, so that in a way he was America's first truly productive microscopist. He put the microscope on the map, as he did so many other things. He just flooded the scene with all his information and all his data. He was a commanding figure.
There's a couple of things that you point out in the book as his significant contributions, and I want to ask you about them. And one of them is he discovered the trichina.
Trichina, yes.
Trichina.
Yes. I may say that because of this work with the parasites, with Trichina, he is known as the father of parasitology. But yes, he discovered small cysts containing the larvae of Trichina in his morning ham, in pork and in pork products. Now, this was a terribly significant finding because what it did was identify the source of human infection of the trichina. When man ate and woman ate trichina, meat or infected material, they developed trichinosis, which was frequently a fatal disease. And it was a terrible public health problem. They didn't know really where it came from, but Leidy showed that it was the eating of infected pork products that did it. And he also advocated as early as 1853 and then again in 1866, he advocated the thorough heating of pork products, and then the threat of infection was eliminated. So, and he also showed that what his discovery signified was the the life cycle of the trichina. In other words, man eats and woman eats the infected pork. It grows in the human. The elimination products of the human are eaten or in some way get to pigs, and the cycle is complete. So it was tying it down to just ordinary public health and sanitation, which is another aspect of this discovery.
You say that Leidy was the person who determined that horses were in North America before the Spaniards brought them here.
Yes. It had commonly been believed that the Spanish had introduced the horse into America at the beginning, in the early 1500s, if not late 1400s. And this was received knowledge. Well, Leidy showed that there were horses in the Midwest in prehistoric times and that they had become extinct. He identified at least 5 species of horse in North America, and that, in fact, the horse arose in America and went and probably migrated to the rest of the world through Asia and so on. It's true that the Spanish did reintroduce it, but it was a reintroduction. It was not something new to America. As a matter of fact, he wondered out loud, in writing, why it was that the horse which flourished in America became extinct. He just couldn't imagine. And then, when it was reintroduced by the Spanish, it flourished in the wild, and it was a question that he couldn't answer. And Darwin must have read his material, because almost the same words, he asks the same question. Why did the horse in North America become extinct? And yet, when it was reintroduced, it flourished. What happened to kill off horses? There's no answer.
How did he discover that there were horses here in the first place? I mean, did he go on archaeological trips?
Leidy was not a field man. He stayed close to home. But people, as I said before, he had the reputation of knowing everything, so that people would send him all sorts of things. That's one source of his material, his specimens of all kinds. But there were professional collectors, fossil collectors. For instance, Ferdinand van de Veer Hayden, a very interesting man, an MD who went west and fell in love with it, became a geologist. He was really a protege of Leidy's, and he stayed out west. In fact, he is the man who's responsible for the Yellowstone National Park, the first national park. At any rate, he kept sending literally carloads of material, fossils, material, back to Leidy. Between 1850 and 1870, Joseph Leidy examined virtually every fossil bone that came from the West. And in this material were teeth, horse teeth. And also, so that this is where the source of his material. He did all of this work from teeth. In addition, at the Academy of Natural Sciences, they had bins of fossil material, and in their collections, which were more or less uncharacterized, just drawers full, he found horse teeth that people had sent in. So through all his work, he must have identified at least 5 species.
You also say that he is responsible for Americans' love affair with dinosaurs.
Yes. Well, let me say that to begin with, that Hayden sent in the fossil material that Hayden sent back, he sent back dinosaur teeth, and Leidy identified dinosaurs as coming from the West only through their teeth. But in about 1857, 1858, enormous bones were found in a marl pit on a farm in Haddonfield, New Jersey. And a friend of Leidy, his name was Fulk, was vacationing there, and he heard about this. He told Leidy. Well, Leidy came running and saw what it was. It was a dinosaur, which he had hauled out. He examined it, and under his supervision, it was reassembled.
Is that the one you have the picture of here?
Yes, and the man under the dinosaur is a man called Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, who actually did the assembling under Leidy and Cope's, but mainly Leidy's supervision. This was the first, well, I shouldn't say it's the first, it's the second dinosaur that was ever assembled like this, one in England, but that was assembled incorrectly. It looked like a giant rhinoceros, 4 square. Leidy got it right. The image of the dinosaur that Leidy had reassembled is the one we know of today, with 2 large hind legs, a large tail, so that's a tripod structure like a kangaroo, and with 2 small, relatively small, grasping forelimbs. This is the image, the everyday image of the dinosaur today, and it goes back to Joseph Leidy.
Where is this dinosaur?
That dinosaur, it's not as complete as that. That wasn't actually the original, but it was very much like it. But the original was much less complete than that. It is in the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia.
What is the Academy of Natural Sciences?
It was, in fact, the first scientific academy in America, founded in 1812, and it formed a library and a museum and a forum for discussion of scientific matters. Politics and religion were forbidden. And Joseph Leidy it was rather exclusive, and Joseph Leidy went in about 1845, was invited to join. And he became the librarian, and then he became the chief curator, which is a job he held for the rest of his life. And in fact, he became the president of the Academy till his death. It was primarily a museum, and it was primarily a place where, for many years, wealthy men, doctors, lawyers who were interested in biology could assemble. And it was only late in the 19th century and the 20th that they start hiring full-time professionals. They were really against that. It was sort of a plaything for many well-to-do people, Philadelphians.
It's still in operation?
It is still in operation, very alive, very well. And
open to the public?
Open to the public, has a wonderful museum. And they just welcome everybody, they welcome membership and so on. They have wonderful displays.
What would you see there if you went, other than the dinosaur?
Well, you have also, they have a wonderful library, but they have, where I work actually, but one of the features they have a room that's very warm because it's just swarming with butterflies of all kinds. You walk in and they'll land on your hand. Just the most exotic butterflies you've ever seen. It's a wonderful thing. It's wonderful for kids. In fact, my grandchildren are coming this tomorrow, and I'm going to take them there.
The butterflies are open year-round?
Well, I don't know. Every time I've gone there, they seem to be there. But they have all sorts of stuffed animals. They have tremendous mineral collections, gems, that sort of thing. It's a museum of natural history. It's very educational. And they, in keeping with the modern idea, they've tried to make it as accessible as possible. You know, not lose that gloomy look. So it's a wonderful place for kids. Anytime you go there, you can hardly hear yourself think because of all the kids running around, so excited and screaming and yelling.
You said in the book that the Academy of Natural Sciences promoted pure science.
Yes.
And the Franklin Institute was practical science.
Yes.
What's the difference between the two?
Well, the Franklin Institute, which was formed about 1824, I think, was founded by rather well-to-do Philadelphians, including, I think, Nicholas Biddle, the great banker, to educate the intelligent working man, to improve his skills, to apply what was learned in science to everyday life, to the various jobs. In fact, now this whole process is everywhere. It's in full flower. The liaison between science and industry is essentially what they were. That was the spirit in which they founded this institution. It was a kind of a night school for working people. They also had a museum, and they also had, I believe, many full-time workers. So, although, you know, an interesting thing about it is that at that time, there was a tremendous amount of labor strife in the city of Philadelphia. You know, with all the textile mills and various foundries that were just beginning to come into existence, iron and coal and so on.
This is the 1820s?
1820s on, yes. And there was exploitation, which you can't imagine. I mean, the 14-hour day, 6 days a week. July the 4th was off, the only holiday, that sort of thing. And the American labor movement really began in Philadelphia, but there was a lot of the labor leaders were very hostile, with, I suppose, good reason. And they were very hostile towards the Franklin Institute. It was just another means by which the wealthy industrialists can exploit the working man. But they lived through that because it did fulfill a wonderful function. It did prevail. And through strikes, the working day went down to 10 hours. And then child labor was abolished and so on.
Franklin Institute is still in operation?
Oh, yes, very much so.
And what would people see if they went there?
Well, first of all, they see an enormous statue of Benjamin Franklin. They would see wonderful exhibits, some of the best exhibits in America of how things work and how, in fact, how the body works. They're wonderful exhibits there.
I want to get back
for the public.
I want to get back to Joseph Leidy, but let me ask you a little bit about yourself.
Yes.
Where are you from originally?
I was born, raised, and educated in Toronto, the University of Toronto. I got my BA there, my medical degree there. I interned at the Toronto General Hospital. I then came to Boston and spread my wings. I realized I wanted to do research. I always did. And I realized I knew nothing. So I went to MIT and got my PhD in biochemistry. And I've been in the lab ever since, till the mid-90s or so. I've always had a great interest in history, and I've always read pretty heavily in history. And gradually I just overtook things. I gave up my lab about 4 or 5 years ago, something like that. And I've been writing books ever since. This is the first, but I have actually a second book that's just accepted by the University of Pennsylvania Press, and I'm about 80% of the way through a third.
What's your second book?
My second is on a miraculous person, I seem to pick them, who crossed paths with Leidy. She was born in 1839. Her name was Adele Field, of the Field family, but a very poor branch. And she was born in upstate New York, bone poor. Became a school teacher, fell in love with a missionary, went to China. When she got there with her fiance preceded her, but when she got there, he was dead, typhoid. But she decided to stay, became a founder of the Bible School for Women. It was a movement in China which was very important, taken over by many Protestant denominations. Became an expert in the Chinese language. Wrote a big fat dictionary, English-Chinese. Translating Genesis into Chinese, she became interested in science and was advised to come to Philadelphia to Joseph Leidy. And he was, in those days, women weren't, educated for this sort of thing. Their place was in the home, but he accepted her.
Well, you mention her in your book.
Yes, I do. And she spent the two, as she said, the best years of her life in Philadelphia. And she went back for a while, but then she came back and she went to New York and she became publishing, and her papers are still quoted today in the scientific literature. And she became very interested in the suffragist movement, a major figure, and in New York politics. And then she got fed up with the New York politics, the corruption, the Tammany, and so on. And she went to Seattle, where she founded several hospitals, was a major figure in the women of Washington State getting the vote, and also had something to do with the abolishing of the white slave trade in Seattle and in Washington, and died in Washington.
What is the name of that book?
I don't know yet. It's Adele Field, with an E at the end.
You are American Cancer Society Research Professor Emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania.
Yes.
Does that mean you've done cancer research?
Yes. When I came, after Boston and after MIT, I went to the National Institutes of Health for about 5 or 6 years, and then I was invited to come to the University of Pennsylvania as a professor, and then I got a professorship of the endowed chair of the American Cancer Society to do research in cancer. And that's what I did for about 30 years or so, and that's enough.
Now you say in here that Joseph Leidy in 1851 almost casually transplanted small pieces of human tumor under the skin of a frog, and at the end of the experiment, 5 months later, found that the tissue had acquired a blood supply and survived. He may therefore be considered a pioneer in experimental cancer research and a deviser of one of its most important laboratory procedures.
Yes. It sounds better than it actually is. It was a brilliant thing to do, but he couldn't possibly understand the significance of what he had done, because the nature of cancer was simply unknown. The idea, cancer is a disease of a malfunction of the control of growth, of cell division. He couldn't have known that. The concept of the cell was just a decade, less than that, about 6 years old. I mean, the whole idea that animals were nothing but masses of cells was something absolutely new. Nothing was really known about how cells divide or how they're formed. Some people thought that they just sort of precipitated out of a jelly. They're just misconceptions. Well, not knowing the fundamentals of cell division and the cellular basis of cancer, you couldn't possibly devise interesting or useful experiments or theories about cancer. It was a very interesting idea, and as I say, once the people knew about these things, tumor transplantation is a major experimental methodology.
Yeah, another of his activities. You say he continued his activities in forensic pathology, responding to urgent calls from a detective or coroner requesting that he examine hair and undergarments with blood or distinguish rust from blood on a gun. For these services, he was paid from $15 to several $100s. And you say that he may have been the first person to use a microscope to solve a crime.
Well, as far as I know, he was. This was pretty early on. When there were to begin with, there weren't that many microscopes around. But the case that I mention in the book is one in which a farmer had been murdered in North Philadelphia. And the next day, the police picked up a man with bloodstains on his overalls and on a hatchet in his possession. He claimed that he had been killing chickens. This material was given to Leidy. They didn't know what to do with it. They gave it to Leidy. Leidy examined chicken blood and his own blood. And it so happens that the red blood cells of a chicken have a nucleus, a circle within a circle. It's very evident. A glance could tell the difference. The human has no nucleus in its red blood cells. He looked at the stains and there were no nuclei. There were no circles within circles. He said, well, it was quite clear that the man was lying, that it was not chicken blood. And the man was so impressed that he broke down and confessed, and he was convicted. So this may, and he did, of course, Leidy did it with the microscope. And this may very well be the first case, certainly in America, maybe the world. I don't really know.
What would he have been like to be around, to spend time with?
He was a very amiable person. As a matter of fact, he was a saintly sort of person. The thing that comes across is how he wasn't just admired, he was worshipped. He never had an enemy. And he was extremely helpful to students. He'd spend any amount of time explaining as if he had nothing else to do. And yet he was a driven man. It's an interesting paradox. It may be that he spent all this time with quote-unquote insignificant students because it forced him to take a break from his work. He could get up at 4:30 in the morning and work till breakfast, and then after breakfast work till 8 o'clock at night without even getting up to take a drink of water. And he was periodically working himself into states of exhaustion. I think that he was very kind to students, well, for the right reasons, but also because it was a legitimate way to stop himself from working. And just like breaking down and with one disease or another, severe headaches, which he had at times, was just a way. Once you're sick, you have a legitimate reason for not working. Respectively, it's not a moral judgment if you can't work. You're not lazy. And he became ill quite frequently because he just kept working. He'd have to go to the shore and spend a month there. But he still kept working a little bit anyway. But this was his way of stopping himself. At any rate, he was a very amiable person. He had many good friends, close friends, who really admired and worshipped him. He was actually taken up by the upper crust of Philadelphia, the main line people, before the main line was actually formed. He was their darling because he was a perfect gentleman, respectable, brilliant, but not pushy, not aggressive. He fit in very well. And they just fawned over him. But he had many friends, lifelong friends. As I said, he never had an enemy.
What did he do for relaxation?
Well, he didn't relax all that much. He would, as a matter of fact, I should say he married late.
Age 41?
Yeah, age 41, and he was sorry that he hadn't married earlier because the marriage was blissful. But she must have been very tolerant because he took his microscope to the dining room table. I don't think many wives would permit that. And even in the midst of company, with all his nephews and nieces running around, there he'd be working. And once in a while, he'd take a break and lift one of his nieces' nephews on his knee and say, "Look down the microscope, look at that sort of thing." He did a little bit of traveling. He went to Europe a few times, but in fact, he worked very hard. There was a monument, a cathedral he missed. And went to the theater and the opera in Paris and London and Germany. I mean, he was the ultimate tourist. He just sort of never really knew how to relax, and yet his image is one of very calm, laid back. You know, there's something so paradoxical. There are unexplained paradoxes in him.
When he was in Europe, did he deal with many scientists?
Oh, yes. He was one of the best-known scientists in Europe. In fact, in 1848 and again in 1850, the professors at the University of Pennsylvania took him along because their charge was to buy specimens, to buy anatomical forms and books and that sort of thing. And they asked him to be their assistant. But in fact, I came to realize that he was such a star, publishing like crazy and read by Europeans, that he was really their entree. He was the entree because they embraced him. Once they went to Berlin, where the great Johannes Müller presided in his institute. And they presented their cards, and they also said that Joseph Leidy is here, and the man who conveyed this to Müller, and then Müller came down, "Which one is Leidy?" You know? So that he was known by people in the field and admired very much. Among the English, he knew and was really admired by Huxley and by Sir Richard Owen and Tyndall, Joseph Tyndall, and many of the great English, and Darwin.
I want to ask you about Darwin, but was American science generally respected by European scientists?
Well, Europeans always had a patronizing view of American science. You know, they figured that Americans were good at practical things, but leave the thinking to them, you know, that sort of thing. And whenever anything came out in an English or an American journal, it was the European journal material that prevailed. They quoted themselves, and they sort of ignored what Americans had to say. This was a tendency. I make a point in the book, I think it's something I've thought about, and that is that America was a client of Europe at that time. Even though its population was growing, it was by mid-century or so, it was the equal of England and France and Germany.
This is the 1850s.
1850s, 1860s. Yet it is a fact they did not have men of the greatest of Europeans, their stature, but they did a lot of wonderful things. But whatever they did was underrated, just as their art was, which I discuss in the book. That I think the estimation and the clout of the science of a country, of a nation, and the art of a nation really to a large extent depends on the economic and political power of the At that time, the United States was a client of Europe. It was definitely below. There was a lot, it was almost an economic colony. There's a tremendous amount of English capital invested in the United States. It was a place to make money for Englishmen and the other Europeans. Well, I think this is reflected in the fact that European art prevailed. Anything done in America was rather provincial and in the boondocks. And it was the same with their science. But since the Second World War, the shoe is on the other foot. Now America is the colossus, for better or worse. It is the power, and its science prevails, and its art prevails. It writes the history. It rewrites the history. It writes the reviews. It does the evaluating. It is arrogant. On our side now, as it was on their side then, a balance will ultimately come. I think Europe is now coming up so that it will match America.
You say in here that his favorite author was the popular Ouida? Ouida, O-U-I-D-A, unknown today, and for good reason.
Yes.
Her novels were shocking bestsellers, preposterously overblown romantic tales with details that bordered on the prurient. One can safely call it trash. Now, what does that say about him that was his favorite author?
Well, it was a quirky little thing. He was not quirky, but this was a quirky. It was. You asked me before, what did he do for relaxation? I suppose this was relaxation. What he did, I'll tell you what he did for relaxation. He did what he did as a boy, and that is that he went up and down the Schuylkill River, the banks of the Schuylkill River, and the Wissahickon Creek, looking under rocks for his pet organisms. He knew the Schuylkill and the Wissahickon backwards, every organism. As a matter of fact, he was dismayed with increasing population and pollution that the number of species decreased. Things that were flourishing 1853 were still there in 1870, 1876, gone. And he was very unhappy about the pollution. In fact, he was one of the people who put a stop to certain companies dumping their toxic wastes into the Schuylkill. That was a long time ago. And I mean, abattoirs would dump all their offal, their wastes and all that sort of thing into the river. Just let it float out past Philadelphia. So that it was really, the river really became polluted, and he was very unhappy about that and worked against. He was also very interested in city water, which city officials said was perfectly fine. And he looked down his microscope and he could see all bits of junk and all kinds of organisms in the drinking water. And very uncharacteristically, he would send vitriolic letters to the newspaper denouncing the city officials who claimed that it was perfectly good when the water was terrible and a source of real danger for spreading of disease.
Why isn't he better remembered?
Well, there are a number of reasons why I think that his name disappeared. As a matter of fact, that's one of the main messages of my book, or the purpose of the book is to answer the question, how could a man who is so popular or fairly well known, but also so revered and so famous and such an accomplished person, disappear after his death, so that most people have never heard of him. I certainly never heard of him. And the answer is rather complex, but there are a number of things that can be cited. One is that he was a quintessential, a true Philadelphian, low-key, understated, modest, never blew his own horn, would never get into a fight or an argument or defend things that he should have defended. his priorities. People who would repeat what he did and not even mention him. He wouldn't do a thing.
You said some of his friends referred to him as an invertebrate.
And without backbone. This is the only fault his friends ever could find in him, that they wish he could not say no, and they wish he would be more assertive because he was taken advantage of. Philadelphia is that way itself. He took on the color of his city. It never had its publicists, its legend makers, its myth makers. In fact, it abounds in detractors. I'm not a Philadelphian, but in my years here, I think it's a marvelous city, much underrated. But that's other people's problems, not mine. I take full advantage of a wonderful city, And he would have done, if he had been a Bostonian, he would be much better known, with all the hoopla and the writers and so on. But there are actually more serious reasons. He refused to speculate, to theorize. If he had had his name attached to some theory, right or wrong, it doesn't matter, but there's something people could latch on to. Einstein's theory, or something, Einstein, although you may not know anything about Einstein or know anything about his theory, Einstein's theories of relativity. Same thing. He never did that sort of thing. All he provided were vast amounts of facts, reliable facts, increased knowledge. Well, this tends to get buried by new facts as they come along, so that they're at the bottom of the pile, so to speak. So he didn't do that. Another thing is that he was what was called a Baconian. He felt that you didn't have to speculate or theorize. Theorizing was lying. It made up for a deficiency in knowledge. If you know the facts, you don't have to worry about theories, which is incorrect. But that is what he thought. He was not an experimentalist. You see, even in his own lifetime, he was becoming somewhat obsolete, because the age of experimentation was coming on fast in the 1880s.
What age was he of?
He was of the old natural historian age, descriptive, non-intrusive. He didn't torture nature, quote unquote. He just observed. He just described. He didn't manipulate nature to see how it worked. But in the 1880s, well, it started before that in Europe, and in fact, Leidy knew some of the greatest of experimentalists, the Claude Bernard in France, and many of the Germans. Despite that, he stuck to his ways. He just, right to the end, he described, brilliantly. He described all sorts of things, all sorts of insights. So he is a remarkable person, but he would not experiment, which is where the future lay. And as a result, even in his own time, as I just said, he was becoming obsolete. The experimenters were taking over, and he was not an experimentalist. But he was revered. He was revered as a saintly human.
We are out of time, unfortunately. This is the cover of the book we've been talking about. We've been talking with Leonard Warren, the author of Joseph Leidy, The Last Man Who Knew Everything, Yale University Press. Leonard Warren, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details. Like us on Facebook.